You know, I thought by now we'd be done talking about inline-six engines, but surprise, surprise, we're not. Now, as a lot of you probably know, the Nissan RB is a family of engines ranging from 2 liters up to 3 liters. In previous videos, we've talked about the RB26 and we've compared it to the 2JZ, but in this video, we're going to look at the smallest version of the Nissan RB, which is the RB20. So let's get into it. Okay, so getting into this, let's look at some of the basics. Now, obviously, this is a 2-liter engine, as mentioned just a second ago, and that's where the 20 in RB20 comes from, because it's a 2-liter. The first 2 applications of the RB20 are the HR31 Skyline and the 200ZR Fairlady, both of which came to life around 1985, making this the oldest Nissan RB engine. As a whole, the RB family was produced from 1985 all the way up until 2003, but the RB20 in particular only made it until 1993. During its production, the RB20 came in a few different variations, and the biggest change between variants was the cylinder head, since some of them are single overhead cam and some of them are dual overhead cam, both of which use an aluminum design. The single overhead cam version obviously only has 2 valves per cylinder, and the dual overhead cam version has 4 valves per cylinder. As Nissan kept iterating the RB20, they moved from the earlier single overhead cam to a dual overhead cam for improved performance and efficiency. As a whole, the Nissan RB engine family is mostly based on the Nissan L20A, which actually shares the exact same bore and stroke as the RB20 does. Now, if we were to look at a few different versions of the RB20, we have the RB20E, the RB20ET, the RB20DE, the RB20DET, the RB20P, the RB20DET-R, and the RB20DE Neo. Looking a little bit more closely at these, the RB20E is the first engine in the RB20 series. It features a single head cam and power around 148 horsepower. The RB20ET is the same as the RB20E, but it received a turbocharger, which is where the T comes from. More specifically, it increased power to about 168 horsepower. The RB20DE features a twin cam design and power around 148 horsepower. The RB20DET is a turbocharged version of the RB20DE with power around 212 horsepower. The RB20P features a 12-valve single cam design and only uses liquefied petroleum gas. Now, this version only produces around 93 horsepower, so it's not something we're really interested in for this video. The RB20DET-R produces 207 horsepower, and the RB20DE Neo produces around 153 horsepower. The version that you and I are most familiar with and most enthusiasts is going to be the RB20DET, which is the turbocharged, most high-performant version of the RB20 that was readily available. So they made the RB20DET-R, but that was limited production. The RB20DET is something that you're actually going to see quite a lot in drift cars. It's a popularly swapped engine, but it didn't actually have a whole lot of applications when it was new. There are 2 main versions of the RB20DET. You have the red top engine and the silver top engine. Although the red top engine is pretty rare in the United States, it can be found overseas in areas like Australia and New Zealand pretty easily. Changes between the red top engine and the silver top engine include the cylinder head, turbocharger, pistons, connecting rods, camshafts, and more. The red top was only capable of producing 190 horsepower, so it's supposedly the less desirable version, but at the end of the day, that doesn't really matter, because as soon as you introduce aftermarket parts to it, it doesn't really matter if you have a red top or a silver top necessarily. In terms of applications, the RB20 was mostly used in smaller Nissan applications. These include the HR31 Skyline, 200ZR Fairlady, the Stagia, Cefiro, Crew, C32 and C33 Laurel, and most interestingly, it also includes the Holden Commodore LV. I know it seems a little bit weird that Holden would use the RB20 as opposed to one of their own engines, but it is something that they actually did do between 1986 and 1988. Holden was kind of in a pickle with their old inline-six engines, and they weren't easily meeting emissions compliance, so they needed something that would meet those compliances while also making the power that they wanted. So, long story short, they ended up with the Nissan RB20. Holden using the RB20 came with its own host of problems, and that's a whole different story for a different time, but it is worth noting. So now that we have an idea of what applications use the RB20, let's look a little bit more closely at the specifications so you can really see what this engine is all about. We were looking at a production run from 1984 to 1993, cast iron cylinder block, cast aluminum cylinder head, inline-six configuration, 78mm bore, 69.7mm stroke, single overhead cam and dual overhead cam variants, 2-liter displacement or 1,998 cc's, 8.5 to 1 up to 10 to 1 compression ratio depending on the variant that you're looking at, a max power anywhere from 93 to 212 horsepower, and a max torque output of 105 all the way up to 195 pound-feet. Something that I think is worth noting is that the RB20 gets its 2-liter displacement in a different fashion than a lot of modern engines. With a lot of modern engines, look at the Honda K20 for example, you'll see a square design where bore and stroke are equal. Now this gives you kind of the best of a big bore and the best of a big stroke. It's a little bit of an in-between, kind of gives you the best of both worlds. But with the RB20, Nissan used a pretty small stroke and a pretty big bore. By doing this, they created a couple of problems, but they also made the RB20 unique. Now the main problem by doing this is that a small stroke engine is going to inherently produce less torque, which is a common complaint of the RB20, is that it's really lacking on low-end torque. But that small stroke also means that there's less piston acceleration and less lateral force on the piston, which means you can achieve a higher RPM more easily. So it's a trade-off. You're going to lose low-end torque, but you're capable of revving to a higher RPM and producing more peak power. Outside the unique bore and stroke, one thing that you will notice from that spec sheet is that the RB20 is pretty gutless in terms of power, with peak power around 212 horsepower, and there's not much to say about this. The RB20 wasn't particularly powerful, even in its best versions, especially compared to later engines like the RB26. But, you know, that's just how it is. Now, as mentioned a moment ago, one of the most common complaints of the RB20 is the lack of low-end and mid-range power. This was caused by a couple of things, but mostly due to the small stroke. Things like an intake, intercooler downpipe, and catback exhaust are a great way to get the RB20 to produce a more linear power band, but of course a lot of that kind of goes out the window once you end up introducing a larger turbocharger that produces more peak power instead of more peak torque. Now, you can try to get around it for as long as you want, but at the end of the day, the stock T28 turbocharger on the RB20 DET is a performance bottleneck and will cap you around 330 horsepower at its absolute best. But with a larger turbocharger, you can go well past this figure and produce a ton of power with RB20. Interestingly enough, aftermarket camshafts are a fairly popular modification for the RB and the RB20 in particular, which is different than a lot of other JDM engines at this time. If you were to think of something like a Honda or an EJ20 or even a 2JZ, aftermarket camshafts really aren't that popular until you're talking about making really big power, whereas with the RB20 it's actually one of the more common modifications, even if you're not making a crazy amount of power. While you might be tempted to think that you can just take an RB20 and turn it into an absolute monster, making a ton of peak power, it might actually be easier for you to start with something with more displacement, such as the RB25. That extra 500 cc's of displacement from the RB20 to the RB25 makes a huge amount of difference on low-end torque, but also peak power. While the RB20 and RB25 aren't as popular or as legendary as something like the RB26, they are much more affordable, at least relatively speaking. The RB25 DET replaced the RB20 DET in 1993, and the upgraded RB25 DET introduced a new variable intake cam system that helped fix the RB20's lack of low-end torque in the lower rev range and mid-range. Of course, the added displacement also helped out with that a ton. Thanks to its larger displacement, it's actually pretty easy to get an RB25 DET to make over 400 horsepower, which isn't something that you can necessarily do with an RB20 DET without a pretty big build sheet. Although the RB20 isn't the most well-known or loved RB engine, it is kind of the grandfather to the whole series. It laid the groundwork, and thanks to its small stroke and big bore design, it is one of the more unique RB engines. Plus, it is one of the more popular RB engines to be used in a drift car because that big bore small stroke design makes it more rev-happy, and drifting is a lot of high RPM usage. On top of that, the RB20 is arguably better sounding than the RB25 or RB26 or even the RB30 because of that rev-happy design and small displacement. And it's pretty much the most affordable Nissan RB engine, at least relatively speaking, because they aren't particularly affordable in the first place, especially if you're in the US. So that's pretty much all I have for you guys today. That's everything you need to know about the Nissan RB20. If there's anything I missed, please drop a comment down below, let me know. I've also included a link down to the article, which includes even more information and more in-depth spec, so check that out. If you enjoyed the video, smash the thumbs up button, get subscribed so you don't miss out on future videos, check out all the other videos on the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next one.